Well, the haters gonna hate, 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 and the fakers gonna fake, 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 baby. I'm just gonna making luck, a Dominion podcast.
Making Luck Minisode. Wandering Winder back with another Making Luck Minisode. I know we've done a number of minisodes here on money, but today, on this episode, I'd like to take a look at something completely different. And if you remember in a previous minisode when we were talking about money, and I was describing the effects of money on your deck, or the effects of card on your deck in the money deck, and when we were talking about drawing cards, I said that when you add a card that draws cards to your deck, you subtract the number of cards that it draws from the denominator of your money density. Well, if you'll notice, there are cards that draw more cards than they are, more than one card basically. And if you get enough of those, you subtract enough, you're ending up getting towards a fraction where the denominator is 0. And obviously when that happens, things blow up. And so once you get towards that range, what effectively is happening is you are changing paradigms. So instead of the money paradigm today, we're going to talk about what I call the whole deck paradigm, the whole deck output, or entire deck output, but generally I like to call it the whole deck paradigm. A lot of people, this is roughly what a lot of people mean when they use the term engine, although that is a little bit of a loaded term. I know Adam is not a big fan of that term because it's a little bit loaded and it has a lot of different meanings to different people, and it's not exactly well defined. But the paradigm I'm talking about today, the whole deck paradigm, is such that instead of the money paradigm, where the amount of output that you can expect on an average turn is basically your average card quality as measured by money density times the number of cards that you have, being usually not much different than your opening 5. Instead, here, the average turn output of your deck is equal to the entire output of your deck. It's all the payload of every card in your deck combined. Now, to be in a deck that actually falls into this paradigm, therefore, you actually need to be able to play all those cards in your deck, to play all your deck, which generally means you need to draw your whole deck. And now when I say your whole deck, and you need to be able to play every card in your deck, I don't necessarily, strictly speaking, mean 100% of the cards in your deck have to be played. What I really mean is you want to be able to play an arbitrary number, any number of cards in your deck that you actually want to play, then you can play. So I don't mean you have to play your estates. Obviously you can't play your estates. Don't worry about that. But I also don't mean, oh, your opponent gave you some ruined minds. If you can't play them, then this doesn't fall into this paradigm. Yeah, you don't technically have to play every card in your deck. But if there is any card in your deck that you want to play, you should be able to play almost an arbitrary number of them. Obviously, there's limited number of cards in the supply, so if you're trying to play, 50 terminal actions and there's only 2 stacks of villages, then okay, whatever. But obviously games don't go that long, so this is kind of a moot point. But the other thing it applies to is, you don't have enough actions to play your chapel, but you've already trashed everything that you already want. Well, okay, this is not a big problem. You don't want to, or you don't care about playing your chapel anymore. If there's a card, the point is, if there's a card in your deck that you care about playing, you're able to play it, basically, or for an arbitrary number of them, right? Sometimes it may be correct that I add an extra payload card before I add an extra village, and I can't play all my terminals for a turn. But in general, on the turn-to-turn basis, the point is you can draw and play, or play without drawing, I guess, if there's somehow a way to do that, like goleming it counts. But you can play an arbitrary number of payload cards in your deck. And why is this kind of definition important? Well, basically, why is it different? Why is it important? Basically, when you have a deck that has this property where you can play everything that you want to be able to every turn, the big thing is once you add a card to your deck, then the output of your deck gets increased not by the difference between the average between that card and the average card times the fraction of turns that you can expect to actually be able to play the card, to draw the card. Instead, what it is it's just increased by the payload amount of that card. Now, obviously, you need to stay in the paradigm of being able to draw and play all these cards to do it. So, it's not just like I added 12 terminal actions to my deck this turn and I don't have any villages. Well, then you've fallen out of this paradigm. So it's not, all roses, oh, I get to for free. Like, obviously you understand this, right? If you're going to add more terminals, you're going to need to add more villages to support it. And you're going to need to add more draw in order to be able to draw and play them. But in general, this can be a really powerful thing. And so let's talk about just some things we can learn from first principles based on this definition. So given that you're drawing and playing every card in your deck that you want every turn, first of all, when we're talking about a deck that's looking to be in this paradigm, the average card quality doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the actual payload of your deck and your ability to actually get that done, right? Many, if not most, decks that fall in this paradigm are not 100% to actually draw their deck every turn. And so there is some fail rate of your first hand doesn't have any drawing cards or doesn't have any villages, and you can't actually draw your deck. So the average output of your turn is basically the percentage chance that you have of drawing your deck times the total amount of payload in your deck when you can. Also, since you're drawing and playing every card you want to in your whole deck, you need to look at things that have diminishing returns versus things that just add linearly versus things that are better in multiples. So something like a discard attack like Militia, most of those, if you stack them, it doesn't help you at all, right? If I play 2 militias, it isn't any better for me than if I played 1 militia, other than obviously the increased money. So if you're in this paradigm where you're drawing and playing your whole deck, a lot of these attacks that have their effect once per turn, you want to have exactly 1 copy of, or maybe none, but generally 1. You want to look at things that are going to help your reliability in order to be able to draw your whole deck and play every card that you want to in your deck every turn. And you want to try to be able to avoid things that are going to hinder your ability to do the same. So reliability is important. And then the output of your deck is important. Gains tend to be important because there's this positive feedback mechanism that often happens in these kinds of decks, right? So my deck output was 8, and now I add a silver, my deck output is 10. And then if I have plus buys, I can buy more things next turn. So I could buy 2 things, and then I can buy 3 things. And there's this positive feedback. The next turn I can buy 4 things. The next turn I can buy 5 things, because I'm continually adding money to my deck that's increasing the output. On my very next turn, I'm going to be able to buy even more things. But in order to be able to take advantage of that, you usually need some form of extra gains. Plus buy is usually helpful, but gains in other senses from workshop or a variant like that are also very helpful. You need to be able to keep adding cards that allow you to continue drawing to your deck in order to keep that reliability up as you're adding more payload. But your payload can really explode because of this positive feedback property. You know, I buy a woodcutter, and then the next turn I can buy 2 woodcutters, and then the next turn I can buy 3 woodcutters. Obviously, you're not only buying the woodcutters, you also have to be getting, you know, a village and a smithy in order to be able to draw them, and another village to be able to play them. So it's not quite, you know, 2, 4, 6 that explosive often. But it does add up very fast. You know, your output is 5 money in a buy this turn, and then the next turn it's 8 money in 2 buys, and then the next turn it's 10 money in 2 buys, and then the next turn it's 13 money in 3 buys, and it can really increase by, you know, a dollar or two a turn, or a coin, I guess I should say, of spending power or two a turn, which is a lot faster than, if you remember in the money paradigm, it's, oh, the marginal difference between the card I added. So if I added a silver that was 2 and my average card was already 1.1, then that's only 0.9, but then I'm only drawing the silver once every 4 turns anyway, so I've added basically 0.1 to my average card amount, and I multiply that by my 5 cards, and I've added, you know, half a money a turn, and that's actually quite a good turn, because usually your deck's thicker than that, and the difference between the silver that you're adding and your average card isn't even that great. So being able to even just add a silver's worth that's fully 2 on a turn is a lot. So you really have this positive feedback mechanism that can explode a lot. The other things, you can play that discard attack every turn. You can wait longer in many cases to green, because well, you can just buy a province every turn because your output every turn is that 8, and so you can really just have 8, 4, 5 turns in a row, as instead of having that variance, because if you're drawing your deck every turn, there isn't variance in your output. I will say there is a big variance because of the reliability. It's less consistent. If you draw your deck, you're very consistent, but you're some chance to do like close to nothing because you don't draw anything. So there's variance in that way, but it's a different kind of variance, right? Some other things we can learn from first principles. Extra money doesn't actually help you in this kind of deck. If you have a fixed number of buys and there is some amount of cards, some cards that are the best cards for you to get at that number of buys. So let's say you only have 1 buy, and the best card that you can get ever in your deck is a province that costs 8. Anything that makes more money than 8, the added benefit of that money does nothing for you, because the way that you're proceeding is you're drawing your whole deck. You know, the difference between 8 money and 10 money in your deck, at the end of your turn you've drawn it all. The extra 2 money to go from 8 to 10 goes to waste. This comes up a little bit in the money density paradigm, but you don't waste much, and you don't waste much that often. Here it's a waste every turn. So you don't want to generally, or there's no benefit generally to I don't want to say overbuilding, because that's usually referring to your ability to draw things, but there's no, and that can be useful for reliability purposes, but there's no benefit towards growing your payload, your output of your deck, by more than the maximum amount that you can usefully use on a turn. Now, if you have 2 buys, then there is benefit again, because I can get 2 5 costs with my 10 if I have 2 buys. Right, but if I have 2 buys, then there's no point in getting anything over 16. If I have 3 buys, then there's no point in getting anything over 24. Whatever the most expensive set of cards for your number of buys is. This is all assuming, of course, that you're not going to be able to add more buys later. If I have 10 now, but I'm going to be able to have 2 buys next turn, then okay. But anyway, this positive feedback, you get quick benefit from adding cards to your deck. You get the maximal benefit out of that card, right? I'm going to get the whole value of my silver basically every turn, or every turn that I actually am drawing my whole deck anyway. Because these decks usually rely on extra buys and gains, and because they get to then do that every turn, they have a great amount of control over when the game ends. You can say, I'm going to draw my whole deck this turn, I can use my 4 buys in order to remove these cards from piles, and that's going to position me such that I'm threatening to remove an additional 4 cards from these piles next turn, and that's going to end the game. So you can play around with threatening to end the game in a very precise way, such that your opponent maybe has to do something that they otherwise wouldn't be able to, or wouldn't like to do, because otherwise you can end the game. Generally you have more pile control in a deck like this, both because you have the opportunity and ability to abuse extra gains and buys, but also because if you're drawing your deck every turn, then you can plan multiple turns ahead, usually even just 1 or 2 turns ahead on, this is how I'm going to be able to empty these piles in a very precise manner. And so that's the main benefits of a deck like this. And this is generally probably the most common kind of deck in Dominion anymore. The most common kind of deck to be the best deck in a given kingdom. By no means is it every kingdom or every board that this is the best kind of deck. And I'm not even sure that it's a majority of boards that this is the best kind, but it often is. It often is. It's probably the plurality, the most common best deck, if maybe not the majority. It also might be, more than half the time it's the best kind of deck to have. Anyway, we've talked about the benefits. Some of the difficulties of this kind of a deck is a lot of times it can be slow to get going, because in order to actually be in this deck, you don't start in a deck that draws itself. You start with 10 cards, none of them draw. You only drawing 5 cards a turn. So you need to be able to eliminate cards that aren't helping you to get into this paradigm. You need to be able to add cards that draw and add cards to give you the actions to be able to play what you want to get into this paradigm. That all takes quite a while to set up, as opposed to a money deck where you start in the paradigm already. So you have to do work in order to transform your deck into this paradigm from the start of the game. So that's a downside. It can be a little bit slow depending on what cards are available, what they give you. You have to maintain your ability to draw the deck in order for this paradigm to function properly. So you need to keep adding more draw cards, adding more cards that give you plus actions, and if that's a little bit hard to do, or if there aren't plus buys in order to be able to, as you add payload, also add these cards that help you keep drawing your deck, then you're going to have some problems in a lot of cases in order to be able to maintain this. And in particular, this is going to be a problem if you have an extended period of time where you're having junk cards in your deck. Usually this is going to come up in terms of greening, right? If you have to be able to buy victory cards over 4, 5, 6 turns, then it's often going to be problematic in order to stay in this place where you are continuing to draw your deck, because it's hard to be adding those green cards and still have the draw and keep adding the draw. It's very difficult to actually do all of that. So usually these kinds of decks need to green over a pretty short period of time in order to keep their reliability very well. And then also the other difficulty or drawback of this deck is you actually need something to do to make it worthwhile to actually do this. So if you're just generating money, then okay, sometimes this is still good, but like how good is it really? It's not that different in this case from just making money, and then it just comes out to being speed. So generally you're going to need some form of plus buy, some form of gain, maybe some attack that's really devastating to other players. Usually there is something there, but it's not a given. It's not trivial. There are some boards where there's all of the pieces and all of the ways in order to be able to draw your deck every turn and get into this paradigm. But you actually need to be able to do something with that in this sustained way. in order for this to actually be worth it. Let's talk about a little bit how these decks get built, not build. They get billed the same way as any other decks. You know, have to buy cards just the same. They get built. How do you build a deck like this? Well, in general, you want to prioritize getting into the paradigm first, and then after that, you want to start ramping up your payload. If you start ramping up payload first, that's going to extend the amount of time that it takes to get into this kind of deck. In particular, if the way that you're getting into this deck is through thinning your deck, which it usually is, thinning your deck of bad cards, then it's harder to thin your deck once your deck is thicker to start with. But additionally, adding payload at the start of the game is going to be less efficient than adding payload later on, right? The big benefit of a deck that is in the whole deck paradigm is that when you add this payload to your deck, you're adding it very efficiently. You're spending $3 for a silver, you're getting a $2 benefit every turn out of it. That's extremely efficient. Whereas at the start of the game, if you buy a silver, you know, you're spending $3, you're increasing your average turns payload by, you know, less than half of a dollar per turn. It's, you know, less than a quarter as efficient, right? So it's much more efficient generally to add payload after you've started to draw your deck than to try to add it first. Having said that, it's not, strictly speaking, 100%. Never ever get payload until you're drawing your deck. For a couple reasons. One, you usually need some amount of payload in many cases to be able to buy the cards that will help you draw your deck, right? A lot of these cards cost, say, 5 or 6, and in order to be able to buy them in the first place, you need a deck that's a little bit better than your original deck. So you're usually going to need to get a silver or 2 or some equivalent amount of economic cards. Sometimes you can do that by getting cards that help you get on your way to drawing your deck and increase your economic benefit. So if you start by opening a smithy, then you're going to be able to hit 5 with that smithy sometimes because it provides an immediate economic benefit, and then later on it's going to help you draw cards, right? So sometimes you can do that, but in a lot of cases you need to add a little bit of economic power in order to actually speed you up in getting the cards you need to get to this point where you are drawing your deck. And then additionally, once you get to the point where you're drawing your deck, like it does help to already have more payload. It starts that positive feedback kind of chain reaction at a higher point on the curve if you have more payload already to start. And so having more payload at that point is better than having less. It's just that you don't want to spend much time adding that payload because it's usually more efficient to spend the time thinning down. But if adding another card won't help you get to drawing your deck much, if at all, faster, then it's still worthwhile. It's still good to add the payload as well. It's not that the payload is bad, it's that getting to the point where you're drawing your deck is usually a higher priority, because there's this inflection point when you switch from I'm drawing some of my deck, I'm drawing my opening hand plus a little bit more, to I'm drawing my whole deck every turn. And once you get to the point where you are drawing that whole deck every turn, there's this kind of inflection point where the amount of payload you have per turn really starts to curve upwards much more steeply than the gradual slope up of a money deck. And so, yeah, that's the basics. You want to generally focus on your draw first. Make sure that you're slowing down your opponent as much as necessary, I guess, is the other thing to mention. You want to make sure that you're having enough time to build this kind of deck up, as it is slow to start. So you may add some things to slow your opponent down if it slows them down more than you. At the same time, you want to be thinning your deck out. You want to be adding the cards that let you draw, so your villages, your smithies, your labs, the cards that increase your sustained drawing power, reducing the cards that are junk in your deck. And then once you get to that point where you are drawing your deck, you want to make sure that if there are attacks, you're playing them every turn, attacks that you want to play every turn, that you are doing so. You want to ensure that you can continue to build your deck with the plus buys and the amount of money that you're going to need to add, both more drawing components as well as that payload, so that you can get this ramp upward. And then once you're at that point, you can start to reassess a little bit based on what your opponent is doing, what you need to do then in order to win the game, whether that's to have really good pile control or whether that's to build up to scoring enough points. And at that point you can figure out kind of how you're greening. At the beginning of the game, you don't need to figure this out, how you're going to end up winning. You don't need to necessarily figure that out. You do need to know that you have an avenue at least that can win in a non-mirror. So if your opponent's going for big money, say, you need to make sure that you're going to have something that can slow them down or score enough points such that if they get off to a faster start than you, you're not just totally dead. So you need to have some plan that, okay, if they go for that, I can do this thing at that point and I should be able to win. But the exact particulars of when you buy what is not something that you should plan from the beginning. You should see how the game has gone, and once you get to that point where you're drawing your deck, you can start to plan out, okay, this turn I'm going to add these things, that's going to give me this amount of money, and at that point you can then plan multiple turns in advance. I'm going to draw my whole deck again, I'm going to have this amount of money and this amount of buys. I can do that the turn after, and then the turn after that I can do exactly this. So you can really plan ahead at that point after you've gotten your deck drawn. But the game really kind of falls into two phases. One, where you're building up your ability to get that deck drawn, as well as doing the other things you need to do to avoid your opponent from crippling your deck with attacks, while also trying to slow them down enough. And then once you get to the point where you're drawing your deck, that's like a point to reassess and plan out, okay, here's how I'm going to build up. And then at some point around that similar time, maybe a little bit after you've built up a little bit more, if you have very little payload to start with, sometimes you just have to build the same way always. But at that point you can really assess, am I going for a pile out? Am I trying to control piles while also scoring some points? Am I building up to a single megaturn where I'm going to score all my points at once? Am I gradually getting 2 provinces a turn, or is it better to go for 3 provinces a turn, or is it better to go for 1 province a turn while continuing to increase my draw and getting my attacks played? Or whatever it is, you can figure that out at that point after you draw your deck. So, step 1 is to get your deck controlled as fast as possible, adding enough payload really just to be able to do that for the most part. More payload is fine for that, but not as good as thinning, not as good as drawing. And then once you get your deck drawn, then plan out, here's how I'm going to increase my payload, and here are my options for controlling when the game ends and making sure that that happens in a way that's favorable for me. But I think that's going to do it for this introduction to the whole deck paradigm. So that's Wandering Winter signing off with another Making Luck Minisode.